I didn't see you there. How's it going? How's your time off? It's been great, right? It's been real, it's been fun. Hasn't been real fun. But speaking of that, neither was Central State Hospital. Central State Hospital, which is what your assignment was yesterday, was part of the social reforms of the antebellum South. Now, Central State Hospital also is located just down the road in Milledgeville. And for a long time, Milledgeville was synonymous with being crazy. If you were from Milledgeville, you were also possibly crazy, right? That was always the joke. We're going to send you to Milledgeville. You kids are going to send me to Milledgeville, right? So, that was the thing. Here's some pictures. This is the main building. It's called the Powell Building. If you drive to Central State's campus, you can see this building. It's the big white building in the middle of the campus. Central State Hospital has about 300 buildings and over 1,000 acres. So it's a huge, huge compound, complex, whatever you want to call it, campus. And it is, it's actually at one point had more people living in the hospitals than the population of Milledgeville. So huge, huge area. And also now it's one of the biggest abandoned places in the state, which is really, really interesting. Here is an example of it. Looks like something out of The Walking Dead, right? This is one of the hospitals. You'll see all around the campus 3-, 4-story buildings dating back to the 1830s even that are all throughout there. There's about 300 of them in all. You can see the state seal here at the top. This is the oldest building, and this picture was taken probably in the 1900s. You can see this building as well. There's a road that goes right by it now, and a stoplight. Yes, there is a stoplight there, even though you won't see very many people out there. Also, there's their own fire department, their own police department, and they had, at one time, the largest kitchen in the world, which is still used occasionally to provide food for disaster relief. So, interesting. And here's a postcard from the Georgia State Lunatic Asylum, dated in 1842. What a lovely postcard to receive, right? All the way back from 1842. Hey, everybody, just hanging out at the Georgia State Lunatic Asylum. Originally, the name was Georgia State Idiot, Epileptic, and Lunatic Asylum. And those were all scientific words at the time. They're not just cut downs or something that sounds silly or ridiculous. Lunatic was a word for someone who had mental illness. Idiot was someone that had a low IQ. And epileptic, obviously, is someone who has seizures. So the original name, even though it sounds maybe silly to us today, was the Georgia State Idiot, Epileptic, and Lunatic Asylum. And actually, the name changed multiple times until eventually it was known as Central State Hospital. But that's not really what we're going to talk about all today. That's kind of recapping what we had been, what you've been reading about. What we're going to talk about today is the Indians that lived in the state of Georgia during the antebellum period. And actually, they lived in the state of Georgia, but then were removed from the state of Georgia. We had been kind of talking towards this point up until this kind of foreshadowing that they would eventually be removed from the state. And this all happens in the antebellum period, specifically in the 1830s. So, Indians. What Indian groups lived in Georgia? Well, we talked about the prehistoric Indians that used to live in Georgia, right? The Paleo-Archaic, Woodland, and Mississippian. Now we're going to talk about the modern Indian groups. All right, there's about 5 of them that you can say lived in Georgia. And these 5 Indian groups were all called the civilized tribes, or the 5 civilized Indian nations. Now, you might be asking, why'd they call them civilized? What does that mean? Well, civilized was a term that was put on the Indians by the white settlers because these Indians adopted what you could call white ways, meaning they dressed like the white settlers, they had businesses like the white settlers, they adopted white clothing styles, language. Some of them even held slaves. Some of them had the same farming, big plantations that some white settlers had. So the reason why they call them civilized tribes, it is kind of an arrogant way that the white settlers kind of projected on the Indians, saying, oh, well, they're more like us, they must be more civilized. But these Indian groups were the Creeks, the Cherokee, the Muskogee, sorry, that's Creeks, the Chickasaw, Choctaw, and Seminole. Sorry. So we're going to talk about two major ones, the Creeks, which are also called the Muskogees, and the Cherokee. So the first group we're going to talk about is the Creeks. So Georgia was still home to several Indian nations during the 1830s, and yes, you can get this PowerPoint off of LMS or off of email if you need me to email it to you. I think the link in Google Docs in both RenWeb and regular RenWeb and LMS. If you're still not getting it, let me know. I'll email it to you. So for years, settlers had classified Georgia Indians as the 5 civilized Indian tribes. And that's what we were just talking about. Civilized meaning they had ways and culture maybe that were more similar to the white civilization. The Cherokee, Creek, and Seminole, Choctaw, and Chickasaw were the 5. Choctaw and Chickasaw lived mostly in Mississippi and Alabama, which were part of Georgia, right, up until the Yazoo land fraud. But these 3, Cherokee, Creek, and Seminole, were in the current borders of Georgia up until the 1800s. So these tribes were known as civilized due to their adoption of white culture, clothing, houses, government, and business practices. Part of the idea here was that these Indians thought that if they adopted white culture, if they adopted the ways that the Europeans or the Americans, the ways of those people, they would then be left alone, that they would be respected, that they would be allowed to stay. The idea being that they had adopted these new ways that the white people had wanted them to have, and therefore they would be treated with respect, or they would be treated fairly. And unfortunately, that was not the case. So the Creek Indians had formed a confederation to protect themselves from settlers. And a confederation is a loose union. We've talked about this before. It is a union of different groups, in this case, different tribes. And these tribes would actually have their own independence, their own autonomy, but they would be grouped together with a larger tribe to protect themselves. So they would fight together, they would work together, they would trade together, but when push came to shove, the problem with confederations is what? They fall apart, right? So if you're not all in it together, people are eventually going to kind of take their ball and go home, so to speak. When push comes to shove, confederations don't work because they fall apart because everyone's mostly concerned about themselves, right? So they do form a confederation. The United States was originally a confederation under the Articles of Confederation. Didn't work out. The South formed a confederation in the Civil War. Didn't work out. There have been successful confederations in the past and presently. Switzerland is actually a confederation. But by and large, confederations a lot of times fall apart when conflict arises. The Cherokee created the Cherokee Nation, which was the name of their kind of country. It was a formal nation that they created. And it had its own capital city, borders, and a government system with a constitution based on the U.S. Constitution. So they actually used our own Constitution, the U.S. Constitution, as a means for them to create their own government. And they thought that, again, if they model everything after the society that is controlling them or seeking to take their land or whatever, that they thought that they would be respected, that they would be allowed to keep their land, keep their ways, and have their own independence. And they had been promised this, actually, by people like Thomas Jefferson, George Washington. Many of the Founding Fathers told these guys, look, adopt our ways, adopt our government, put yourself to good use in industry and farming and agriculture, all that stuff, and you will be respected, and we will give you all the things needed to continue to be successful. Unfortunately, they do that, and their land is still taken from them. So we're going to talk about that. But first, again, we're going to talk about the Creeks. So the Creek Indians first, they were removed actually before the Cherokee, and they were mostly in middle to southern Georgia. North Georgia was mostly where the Cherokee were. Far, far southwest Georgia is where you might find Seminoles, but the majority of the state is mostly where you would find Muskogee Creek Indians. And again, they were known as Muskogee Indians. The white settlers are the ones who called them Creek Indians, mostly because they settled around creeks and rivers. So you would find their villages around creeks and rivers. This is because I mean, most settlements back then, regardless of whether you were Indian, white, black, yellow, whatever, they were mostly around rivers. You need rivers for trade, travel, food, water, obviously. So Creek Indians, they were known for their villages being around bends in creeks. So Creek Indians usually had villages near rivers and creeks, like I said. There were two main groups, though, of creeks. There were the upper creeks and there were the lower creeks. Right? Upper creeks and lower creeks. And these were different, very different factions of the Creek Indians. Now, all creeks were, again, we call them creeks. They call themselves Muskogees. But even among the Muskogee creeks, they had their own divisions. All right? So, the upper creeks were mostly located in the Piedmont region around here and in Georgia and Alabama. And the lower creeks were mostly located in the coastal plain region, so South Georgia, Alabama, southern Alabama, southern Georgia. But the Indians that would have lived around here were called upper creeks. And they posed some problems to a lot of the white settlers. The upper creeks were known as Red Sticks. The Red Stick Indians, again, this is just another term for upper creeks, upper Muskogees. Red Sticks is believed to be why they wore this red war paint. Actually, the capital of Louisiana is Baton Rouge, right? Baton Rouge, Louisiana is a French word that means red stick, right? So those Indians were throughout that area, and these were very feared Indians by the settlers. So during the War of 1812, Upper Creeks fought with the British to get their lands back from the Americans. Now, here's obviously a question. What the heck is the War of 1812? What is that? Well, we've talked about it a little bit. We kind of alluded to it, mentioned it. But the War of 1812 is this largely forgotten about war in U.S. history. It's kind of like the American Revolution, the sequel. It's part two. It takes place in the early 1800s, 1812 to about 1814. There is this war fought by the United States against Great Britain because they are refusing to respect our sovereignty, our national power. And they're attacking our ships at sea. They're taking our sailors and they're putting them in their ships and making them basically, they're impressing them is what it's called. It's like they're making them work on their ships. They're making them work for them. They're basically, stealing our guys, stealing our stuff. And the Americans are furious about this. And the British don't really respect our national sovereignty. So America goes to war. It's under the presidency of James Madison, the father of the Constitution. This comes to define his presidency. Now, the War of 1812 is, again, largely forgotten about here in the United States. But if you were to travel up north to the Great White North, Canada, you will find statues dedicated to the War of 1812. You will find every little school child knowing about the War of 1812. It is part of their national identity because of what happens in the War of 1812. Now, you might be saying, did we lose the War of 1812? Did we win the War of 1812? Well, the answer is kind of, depends on how you want to look at it. We did not necessarily lose the War of 1812, but we also did not necessarily win the War of 1812. The War of 1812 is kind of ends in a stalemate or a tie, if you want to think of it like that. The United States, in the beginning of the war, we invade Canada, hoping that the Canadians will join us, and then they'll be like, yeah, or we can take over Canada and get all that land and all. But unfortunately, the Canadians fight back. The Canadians and the British regulars combine up. They fight off the Americans and force us to retreat. We invade again, we retreat. It's just this ongoing thing. The United States is not able to take Canada. The United States is not able to get the Canadians to join America. So for the second time, Americans invade Canada. For the second time, Americans lose. 0-2, by the way, against Canada. Man, stinks. But then the British invade the United States actually at one point, and I'll show you a picture in a second. They invade, they burn Washington, D.C. to the ground, they burn the Capitol, they burn the White House. I mean, it's a huge moment of national shame. It's this horrible time in American history. Can you believe it? The White House was burned by the British. A British flag flew over the Capitol, flew over Washington. It's a weird and really bizarre point in the United States history that we don't like to talk about. But there are successes as well. Andrew Jackson, who will later become president and define, these people in the Cherokee by moving them. He is actually the war hero. He wins this amazing underdog battle where the British are invading New Orleans. He kicks them out. Everyone's like, yes, and the war ends, right after that. So this ushers in a time period they call the Era of Good Feelings, which is, man, what a great name, the Era of Good Feelings. Definitely not what we're living in right now, am I right? But the Era of Good Feelings is where everybody has this national kind of like contentment or good feelings about, we're this great nation. We've created this great thing here, and everything's going good. We're making money. So do we win the War of 1812? Maybe not, but we come out of it feeling like we've achieved something because we didn't lose. So take that, Great Britain. But during the War of 1812, obviously the Indians fought against the Americans. Why would they fight against the Americans? Well, the Americans live with them. Who's oppressing them? The Americans. The British come in. The enemy of my enemy is my friend, right? So I'm going to side with the British. I don't fault the Upper Creeks for that. But the Lower Creeks fought with the Americans. So the Lower Creeks sided with the Americans in this, and they fought alongside the Americans. So the Creeks, again, during the War of 1812, there were many atrocities and massacres during it. It was a rough time in the frontier areas, Alabama, Tennessee, all that. A lot of fighting went on out there, a lot of massacres. Fort Mims Massacre, Battle of Horseshoe Bend. Fort Mims Massacre is where the Indians attacked the white settlers, and they tore into this fort and killed everybody. And in response to that, the Americans went and attacked a village, an encampment of Creek Indians, and they massacred them all. So, there's these massacres that are being responded to by more massacres and people being killed, and it's really rough. And in the frontiers is where this is all going on. At the end of the war, another smaller war was called the Creek War, where the British had already left, but the Creeks were still fighting. So we had to finish off the Creeks and figure out what we're doing there. Andrew Jackson's the main guy fighting that war. The U.S. Army, led by Andrew Jackson, defeated the Red Sticks. They were forced to surrender, to give up, and to move or give up land all throughout the U.S. frontier. Jackson invited all the Upper and Lower Creeks Indian chiefs that were called Mikos to a meeting to seek peace. So he wants to get all the Upper Creeks, all the Lower Creeks together and have a peace meeting. Now, this is kind of a setup by Andrew Jackson. He's a very calculating guy. He's always thinking ahead of everybody else, and he does not necessarily view all the Indians as equal. He does actually. He groups them all in together. Sorry. Even though the Lower Creeks fought with us, he's not really someone who cares, I guess, about the Indians and Indian affairs and who's who. So he invites them all to this meeting. Only the Lower Creeks show up, which were the allies of us. So the only Indians that really show up at this meeting are the Lower Creeks, our allies. So what does Jackson do? Well, he's actually forced to give. He actually forces the Indians to give up their land, and they're like, "Wait, this is our land. We fought with you. We should be keeping our land. That's why we fought with you, so that you would, help us." And Jackson has none of that. He's like, no, this is going to be better for you in the long run. Give me your land, give up your land, and we're going to move you somewhere else. Or we're going to take you, and we're going to just keep pushing you further away, taking more and more of your land, and you're going to be good with it because I said so. Basically, that's how Jackson is. So he makes them give up all their land in Georgia and the U.S. To the U.S. government. And again, this is their own allies. This is the U.S. allies. This is the Lower Creeks, not the Upper Creeks. The Creeks were constantly under more and more pressure to give up more and more land to white settlers. Chief William McIntosh of the Creeks, he was actually half white. His father, McIntosh, his father was Scottish. He sought a deal with the state and national government, accepting thousands of dollars for the Creek Indian lands. Now, This infuriates the Creeks because their own chief is taking a large sum of money to give up all their lands. And the Creeks are not going to have any of this. They're not happy about it. Still there? Anyways. So, yeah, they're not real happy about him giving up their land, taking a big bribe, I guess. McIntosh also tried to persuade the Cherokee chief, whose name was John Ross, to accept money from the government, but Ross warned the Creeks. Okay, so Ross is a Cherokee, and he gets this letter, I guess, from McIntosh saying, "Hey, the white settlers, they'll give you money if you give up your land. This will be best for our people. This will be best for everybody, and they'll give you money." And John Ross is like, "No, we're not doing that. And also, I'm going to tell your people how shady you're being because that's messed up." So he tells the Creeks, even though he's Cherokee, he tells the Creeks, "Hey, your chief is doing some underhanded business dealing, some shady stuff. So maybe you want to take care of that." But yeah, he warns them about this corrupt leader that is Chief McIntosh. And although the Creeks had the support of many, even John Quincy Adams, who was the president of the United States at the time, it wasn't enough. They're still removed. Part of it is because of these bribes and these debts that they had and these different treaties that they had made. And the Creeks are in a spot where they have to be moved. They've lost so much land. They're in too deep. They've got to be moved off the land. And even though the president, John Quincy Adams, sides with them, it's still not enough. The president is not the all-powerful sovereign of the United States. There's certain things that he does not have power to do. And even if he did, sometimes presidents, even if they might support the Indians, the public support was not for the Indians. So if the president went against his public support, he's probably not going to get reelected, right? He's probably not going to get back in the job. How far are you willing to go for these people that everybody else in the country seems to despise? So, they're moved anyways. McIntosh, however, was killed by his own people. Sadly, McIntosh, while he's at home, his house is lit on fire in the middle of the night by his people. He comes running out of his house to be greeted with a group of Indians that murder him. So not only is his house burned down while he's in it, he comes out of the house and he is killed by his own people. They're not happy about this. They have this rule that you don't betray your own people. You don't give off the land. You don't sell off the land for the entire group of people. So yeah, he's killed by his own people. Look at this guy. What a brave dude. You know who that is? That's right. That's Andrew Jackson. They called him Old Hickory. Andrew Jackson was a larger-than-life guy, maybe insane. I don't know. He was a general. He was a president. He fought. This is the Battle of New Orleans. Obviously, this is a painting that somebody wasn't there, painting while all the events were happening. So, you might be saying, like, why would he stand up there? Well, he probably didn't. This is a painting, but maybe he did. He was also, kind of had some screws loose. He was kind of out there. They called him Old Hickory. He fought in some estimates say that he was in over 100 duels in his lifetime, fighting people for his honor or for his because he was in an argument with them or whatever. There was actually a thing at the time. People used to joke and said that he jingled as he walked. He had been shot so many times. There's so many bullets in him. Now, he did actually have a bullet lodged so close to his heart that they could not remove it. And he had that for the rest of his life. He also had a scar across his forehead from a British soldier. When he was 13 years old, a British soldier cut him across the head when he would not comply to shine the soldier's boots during the American Revolution when he was just a kid. So he was a pretty hardcore guy. Somebody tried to assassinate him one time, pulled out 2 pistols on him. Both pistols misfired. Andrew Jackson, who was an old man at the time, gets his cane, hickory cane, and beats this guy almost to death. Somebody who was attempting to kill Andrew Jackson. Andrew Jackson turns it around on him, almost beats this guy to death. They have to pull Jackson off of this assassin to save his life. So Larger than life figure, crazy guy. He's on the 20 for now. He's actually going to be removed from the 20. Spoiler alert. But that's okay. That's not, that's not here or there. But yeah, the British attacking. There's a song from the 50s, the Battle of New Orleans. Check that out if you want to. Here's the burning of the White House in the War of 1812. This is the White House. British soldiers all around it, up in smoke, right? Terrible. National tragedy. The White House has been burned. If you go to the White House, you can see there are, in some rooms, in some areas, you can see the original brick where it's blackened from when it was burned back in the 1800s. So crazy. And it had only just been built, right? It was a brand new building. Here's Horseshoe Bend. This is where this massacre took place, where Creek Indians were here in the bend. American soldiers approached and pinned them in, and the massacre ensued. The Indians were not able to escape. They were taken completely by surprise, and they were massacred there. Here is a Creek Indian, a Red Stick Indian. You can see here, yes, they fought with muskets. They had the same weapons as the white settlers. They didn't all just have bow and arrows and tomahawks. Did they have those? Yeah, probably. But they also had real modern weapons like the Americans and British did. They were what they called the civilized tribes, right? They had the same technology, a lot of times better technology, believe it or not, than some of the white settlers. This is a painting of the Fort Mims massacre. Fort Mims massacre. This is designed to make you fear the Indians, right? We've got a man holding this woman here, like, oh, what a tragedy, right? There's children and there's women. They're putting a lot of attention on the women, right? It's like these Indians are savages, right? They're just killing people mercilessly. Yeah, they were, but this is not unique to what happened throughout the war. The Indians were not the only ones doing this. But this is kind of the perception that these, the bloodthirsty savage is what the words that they would use, right? And that's not really a fair depiction. Was this, savage? Yeah, that was. But they weren't the only ones doing this. There was also atrocities going on by both sides. So it's important to keep that in perspective. But this was the Fort Mims massacre. Red Stick Indians overwhelming the defenses at Fort Mims. Here is Chief McIntosh. You can see him. His mother was an Indian. His father was Scottish. He has a sword there. He has a tartan plaid like his father possibly. His father's clan back in Scotland possibly. And then of course he's got the some clothing articles that makes him look more Indian as well. Here's the land that was gradually given over by the Creeks. You've got from 1733 to 1805, and then in orange, 1818, 1832, and then this would have been where the lower Creeks were, 1814 here. So the orange is really where the upper Creeks would have been, which actually is right around where we are. A lot of the land, though, where we were was given all the way back kind of beforehand, early 1800s, late 1700s. But let's talk about the Cherokee now. The Cherokee, on the other hand, they were allowed to stay a little bit longer. They were not removed from Georgia until the 1830s. And really the major reason why they are eventually removed is because of this, the gold rush that takes place in Georgia. Georgia is the first place where a gold rush in the United States actually takes place. The first gold rush in U.S. history. It's before the San Francisco or California gold rush, Alaska gold rush, all those type of things. It's not a huge gold rush. But it is significant, and it takes place in the city of Dahlonega, which is Cherokee Indian land at the time. So, in 1828, I don't know if you can see that, you have the PowerPoint hopefully. 1828, gold is discovered in present-day Lumpkin County in Dahlonega. This was Cherokee Indian land. This was their land, but the white settlers want at it, right? I mean, like, why do the Indians need this gold? We need the gold. We need them off so we can get the gold, right? Gold makes people a little crazy, right? So many whites now wanted a forced removal of the Cherokee. We want them off the land. We need them out of there so we can get to that gold. So The Cherokee had been living in northern Georgia, Tennessee, North Carolina for hundreds of years. They had been there for a long time. This is their ancestral lands. This is the land that they have lived on. Their grandparents, their great-grandparents, generations of Cherokee had lived in this area. And their territory had been gradually and gradually reduced to really just North Georgia and parts of Tennessee and parts of North Carolina. But really, North Georgia is where the biggest chunk of Cherokees live. This is where their capital was. It was called New Echota. We'll talk about that. So they had a complex political system similar to the United States. They had a government that was a lot like our government that they set up. They had a capital city that had a judicial branch, a legislative branch. They had an executive who was the chief. Most had accepted Christianity, so many of the Cherokee Indians were Christians. They had churches. They had missionaries from all over that had come and established these churches. They had created their own written language, which was unique to a lot of Indians. Most Indian tribes do not have a written version of their language. The Cherokee did. So they had a constitution that they based on the U.S. Constitution. Their capital city was New Echota, which was in present-day Calhoun, Georgia, up in North Georgia. You can visit that today. New Echota is a historical site today. They've rebuilt a lot of the buildings there. But Sequoyah, famous guy, you need to know Sequoyah. Sequoyah was a Cherokee from Georgia that developed the Cherokee's very own system of writing. It is a syllabary. So a syllabary is not quite an alphabet, but it's similar to an alphabet. Okay, it relies on syllables, not necessarily the same thing as our alphabet. Our alphabet, obviously is letters that stand for sounds, and the sounds are put together to make words, right? It's a little different system, and I don't speak Cherokee. I don't know exactly how the ins and outs of it work, but it is a syllabary. It's not a full alphabet, but it's similar. So symbols stood for syllables and letters, a little bit more complex. And syllabary. This has to do with the Cherokee language as well. I'm told that makes sense with the language. The language has a lot of sounds that we don't have in our language. It's very different than English or European languages. So I think it has something to do with some of the sounds. Their syllables. I don't exactly know the ins and outs of that, but they had their own newspaper though. It was called the Cherokee Phoenix. They printed their own newspaper. They printed their own Bibles. In Cherokee, they have, if you go up to some of the Cherokee reservations in Oklahoma and in North Carolina, actually, their stop signs are written in Cherokee. Their signs across all the buildings and everything all have Cherokee writing on it. The Georgia government insisted that all Cherokee be removed and even forced any white settlers who lived in Cherokee lands, even if they were missionaries, they had to sign something called an oath of loyalty. This basically said, if you don't sign the oath of loyalty, you will be put in jail. And if you do sign the oath of loyalty, you can't help out the Cherokee over us. So it's like putting a law on their own people, on Georgians, non-Cherokee, that they had to side with the state. They couldn't protest or go against the state's laws. And if they didn't sign this, they would be put in jail. So it's really just putting them in an unfair position, because even if you think what the government was doing to the Cherokees was wrong, you couldn't protest it. You couldn't go against it, or else you were labeled a traitor to your own people. Many missionaries and pastors tried to help the Indians, and if they refused, they were thrown in jail for treason, they said. And Chief John Ross, the Cherokee chief, he fought this so desperately. He tried to keep their lands. He insisted that they have legal rights to be there. They had treaties by U.S. presidents. They had treaties by the government of Georgia. They had treaties by the U.S. government. They had the authority to be there. But unfortunately, these are all overlooked. So what do? Do they pick up guns and they fight? Do they, start fighting back with their military, with their braves? No, the way the Cherokees choose to fight is the way that they feel like is the most respectable and the way that they're supposed to get things done. They are in many ways believing, we're going to believe in the process. We're going to believe in the legal side of it. We're going to go to the highest court in the land, the Supreme Court, right? So they actually sue the U.S. government for removing them. So they take a case to the Supreme Court. Do they win the Supreme Court case? Actually, yeah, they do. They win, right? They win the Supreme Court case. It's called Worcester versus Georgia. They win the case. Yay, fanfare. Everyone's excited. This is great. The Cherokee won. They're going to be able to keep their land, right? Right? No. Who's in charge of carrying out the laws and the decisions by the Supreme Court? The president, right? The executive, right? If a Supreme Court decision is made, it has to be carried out. Someone has to enforce this ruling, right? Whether it's Congress or the president or whatever, a ruling just, it doesn't determine what's going to happen if everyone's just going to ignore it, basically, right? Well, who's the president at this time when this decision is made? That's right. Andrew Jackson, right? Who we already know isn't the hugest fan of the Indians, right? He has a prejudice against many of the Indians. Some people could argue, well, he doesn't have a prejudice or he doesn't hate the Indians. He just thinks they're going to be safer in Oklahoma. Meh. Okay. Well, and that is how he writes. He writes in a very, what he thinks is a fatherly way. He's like, I'm going to take care of you. I'm your great white father. He's not actually, if you read it, it's kind of condescending. And I'm going to put some of that, those documents in your assignment for you to read. But, and tell me what you think. But it's kind of condescending the way he writes to them, the way he addresses them. He's kind of pandering to them, but also disrespecting them at the same time. And he says, you'll be safer if you just move and we get your land and your gold. And, everything's going to be better that way. And, the governor of Georgia, Wilson Lumpkin, he wants the Indians out. So he doesn't care what the Supreme Court ruling is. He's kicking them out either way. And there's just not a lot of public support for this decision that the Supreme Court made. Everybody disagrees with it. They don't care that the Supreme Court said the Indians can stay. So they do it themselves. I mean, many white settlers start moving onto the land and start forcibly kicking out Indians by gunpoint. Going into these houses, these Cherokee houses, and just kicking them out. It's sad. It's unfortunate. President Andrew Jackson refused to accept the ruling and forced them out anyways. So that happens. It's sad. And this removal is called the Trail of Tears. Right? The Trail of Tears is the forceful removal of the Cherokee people from, again, North Georgia all the way to Oklahoma. So they've got to walk in winter. By the way, they start this in February. They walk all the way from North Georgia to Oklahoma. And you might think that's a straight shot, but they don't actually go a straight shot. They go up and around. They go all the way as far as like Illinois and Missouri and down, which is like crazy. You might be saying, but Coach Ringer, why'd they walk all that way? Why didn't they just walk straight? Well, it's because there was white settlements and white towns in between that, and they didn't want to go anywhere near all the people, so they took them way out of their way to avoid, being around people, I guess. Over 1,000 people died in the Trail of Tears. It was terrible. Most of them were elderly and children who were not suited for exposure to the cold, the diseases in the wintertime, lack of food, lack of water, lack of clean drinking water, exhaustion, exposure, all that kind of stuff. Very, very sad. This is a national, to the Cherokee people, this is like, the equivalent of the worst thing that's happened in their history. It's national shame to them. It's national, they still mourn over this, the Cherokee. But this is their alphabet or syllabary. This is Sequoia here, one of the most famous Cherokee. And this is what it all looks like now. Many of the letters look a lot like our letters because he used them as inspiration, but they're not the same thing. They just look like them. And you can see there's a lot of them. So yeah, Sequoia. Here are Cherokee Indians. This is the delegation to Washington. This is the group that went and fought for the Cherokees' rights to stay in North Georgia, dressed very similar to the way that any other average American would have been at that time, right? Have their hair cut and their beards and mustaches and all. They look just like any other group of Americans at that time, but they were treated much more poorly, right? They were persecuted for their ancestry, even though they had adopted the ways that they thought they were told to adopt. That they would, if they would simply do the things like the white settlers, you're going to be good. Unfortunately, it's not true, right? This is John Ross. Again, looks like, looks like he could have been, one of the presidents of the United States. One of these old pictures of somebody. You wouldn't necessarily know the difference, right? But he was the chief of the Cherokee. He actually owned a plantation. He had a number of slaves that he owned as well. He grew cotton. He was, very similar to many other aristocrats in the South at the time. He was wealthy. He was the chief of the Cherokee. This is the Trail of Tears. This is where they were marched all the way across from all these different places. The Seminole were actually removed by boat through Louisiana and up into Oklahoma. And Oklahoma was called the Indian Territory back then. So, yeah. Is this still working? Yes. Sorry. I'm trying to figure this thing out. Anyways, so here's a famous picture of the Trail of Tears. All these people being moved across the country. In the picture, they're on horseback and wagons. Believe it or not, in the real Trail of Tears, most people had to walk by foot. The average person was walking by foot, actually walked the entire distance all the way to Oklahoma. There weren't as many wagons and horses as you might think, as this picture would suggest. Many of the older people or the younger people would be in the wagons and horses. Most everybody else had to walk. It's a long walk. So, Trail of Tears. So, it's the last thing. So, in 1838, 15,000 remaining Georgia Cherokee were rounded up by the U.S. Army and forced to walk towards Oklahoma. A couple hundred escaped into hiding in the mountains of North Carolina. We call this the Qualla Indian Reservation today. It's called Cherokee, North Carolina. If you've ever been up to Cherokee, North Carolina, that's a group of Indians that escaped this and hid out in the mountains, and they're still there to this day in the Cherokee Indian Reservation up there. The march took place in the dead of winter in February, and thousands died along the way. Most were the very old and the very young who died, and their lands in North Georgia were given away in the lottery system so that settlers could move on, mostly for the purpose of panning for gold or mining gold. So yeah, and of course the railroad went straight across it as well, which we've already discussed. The Western Atlantic Railroad went right through Indian lands, and that's actually Atlanta, started in Atlanta, went to Chattanooga. So that's it. That's the Indians in Georgia. I hope you paid attention. There's going to be some questions coming forward about this, and I'm going to put some questions out there. This is good for you to watch and study, because there will be a test on all this stuff, and hopefully this helps. And I hope you're staying safe and staying healthy and washing your hands. And I miss you guys. This stinks. I'm sorry, but we'll get through it. But have a good day. Miss you guys. Love you. See you later.